Hello, everybody. Welcome back to episode two of the Freight Desk here with my colleague Andrew again. Good afternoon, Andrew.
Good afternoon, Graham. Welcome back to the United States, huh?
Thank you. Thank you. I woke up in Dublin at 6 a.m. and with the marvels of international travel, I was at my desk in Manhattan for slightly before midday. So, um, pretty amazing technology there. If we could get the ships to go that fast, everything might be easier.
Ships don't move
Um,
fast.
Very true. Very true. Lots to talk about today. Um, when we think about our core group of customers at Ship Angel, you just have to think it's just, crisis to crisis. We just have had so many. COVID was, a once in a lifetime experience in every way. It was terrible, terribly complex and costly for shippers. And then we moved to Red Sea and Ukrainian war and all sorts of, and now we're in the middle of a tariff situation. And we've seen since our last episode, Andrew, we've seen a pause on the 145% and a move down to a 30% on China. Um, and cargo is flowing. We've got peak season coming up in the middle of all this. What do you see in the next 6 to 8 weeks?
Well, it's certainly going to be a lot of cargo moving. I think every US importer is trying to figure out how much cargo can I move today, tomorrow, next week, next month. I think they've spent a lot of time contacting their factories, understanding what they can or can't move up, because at the end of the day, it's just a pause, or even a pause slash reduction in tariffs. It's not over. This roller coaster is simply going into its, valley. There could be a peak here coming soon, in about, I think it's 82, 80-ish days now. The US government and China have agreed to a 90-day reduction in tariffs, but at the end of the day, it's 90 days. And so everyone's going to be trying to move as much as they can. From what we're seeing in a lot of the major indexes, the spot rates are starting to jump already. I mean, we're barely a week into this pause, and they've already jumped in some scenarios, 30% on the West Coast and 20% on the East Coast, give or take, which is significant, because essentially where we've been is at sort of the bottom of spot rates for the last 3 to 6 months. We've kind of been the lowest levels that we've seen. And so these rates are starting to climb, and we're getting word that there's a lot of PSSs coming, a lot of GRIs for June. It's going to be very interesting to see how the carriers react, matching that capacity with these now favorable spot rates. Are they going to bring a lot of capacity back online? They a week ago we were talking about them pulling out capacity, removing strings, taking away ships, blank sailings, and now we're going to be talking about increased rates. How quickly do they bring back online all of that capacity that they took out? That's going to be the questions and the answers that we're all looking for.
Yeah, very true. And I mean the numbers are also quite interesting, right? I mean, we're looking at on the Trans-Pacific trade into the West Coast, um increases already in the double digits. Um and we're hearing about spot rates that are a multiple of where they are now. Some suggestions of between five, six, maybe even $7,000 per container.
Those are significant numbers. And I think what's really important is to compare those numbers against the long-term contract rates that were just signed on the Trans-Pacific. And so, depending on the size of the importer and the amount of business that they signed with, rates on the West Coast were less than $2,000. Maybe we're some BCOs were a little bit lower than 2000, but if we use 2000 as a sort of average, we're looking at numbers up to $6,000 on the West Coast, which is a lot bigger than $2,000. My grade level math tells me that 6,000 is a lot more. And so what it tells me is if you didn't have your long-term contracts locked in, if you didn't have your allocations set that were favorable to your supply chain, you're now going to have to buy a lot of space on the spot market. And it's be really interesting to see which BCOs planned well and which ones maybe could have adjusted their plans now versus previously.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And when we look back over the last 5 years, when we've seen as I mentioned earlier, shippers moving from basically crisis to crisis. It's like a new normal. Um, when we look at, particularly the COVID hikes, I know they were all-time highs, but I still remember 40-foot high cube from Ningbo. Um, that was $22,000. It's just, numbers that were staggering. But, one of the things that was very interesting was that the carriers looked at annual contracts as you know, I think, a long time ago they were they were set in stone. If you had a $2,000 per 40-foot rate, it was pretty much that number for the entire year, whereas now you have the possibility of emergency peak season surcharges. Um, some carriers have, kind of guaranteed loading surcharges that run into the thousands of dollars. Well, they did back in the last crisis, and then you have the Red Sea situation, which is not going away. Um, it's going to cause it, I mean, it's disruption on disruption, right? So you've had a pause in your Chinese loadings, and now you're trying to redo them. And at the same time, you are trying to plan out your contract versus spot, your allocations and carriers. Um, it's pretty tough to be a shipper.
It is, and you mentioned sort of guaranteed loading fees that we saw during the kind of late COVID era. What was interesting is back then it wasn't necessarily, okay, I pay a peak season surcharge. Maybe it's $2,000 a box. I'll pay it. I want to get on a ship. Great. We'll get you a booking. We'll get you on a ship, but you also need to pay the fee just to get the equipment. And in some cases, that was the bigger issue that we resulted in some of the COVID disruptions was there wasn't enough equipment because equipment flows were drastically changed. And in international shipping, specifically on the Trans-Pacific, when cargo goes back to Asia, usually it's empty or it's filled with some low value cargo. The US exports, as proud as we can be, what leaves the United States in terms of dollar value is lower than what comes in. And those flows weren't matching the flows that were coming inbound. And so you had a lot of container shortages across Asia. It'll be very interesting to see, do we see equipment shortages again as demand grows, as the rates go higher? Do they continue to go higher because now you need to pay an equipment fee? I need to pay a local truck fee. Those extra fees, you might say are scandalous to use a fancy word, but it's a free market. At the end of the day, what does it cost to move that container? And that cost is a continually moving point in the equation.
Absolutely. And I spoke to a retailer last week, and they told me that they had started their kind of reshipping in China a bit earlier than most other companies had. And the driver behind it was that for them, the worst case scenario, like the worst case scenario, was empty shelves. Um, and again, if you think about that from a retailer's perspective, you go to a store to pick up something for your car, you go in there, you have a bad experience, they don't have it, you may not go back in there again. So we saw quite early some big retailers making that decision to jump back in. And then obviously with the pause that followed, we've had, a couple of weeks now of China bookings going up pretty dramatically, leading to these shifts. Um, but again, from a shipper's perspective, if you kind of push out towards that 90-day limit, you're getting to that period where you are probably shipping your kind of end of year Christmas cargo. Um, so I mean, are we, I guess that's just going to extrapolate the situation, right? It's gonna mean even higher volumes than just picking up from the month that we lost to the tariffs.
Yeah, I think why most of us are trying to plan our summer vacations or trips to the beach or maybe trips across Europe, a lot of importers are already figuring out what is the most important cargo that I need to have here before Black Friday. Because if you don't have that good on Black Friday, you can't run that special discount sale for that special hit product that you plan on launching at the end of the year. And so a lot of those conversations and planning are happening right now, and they were probably going to be having those discussions soon. But as soon as that notification on the sort of pause in the tariffs, all those discussions got moved up, certainly in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and it's also really interesting as well to see how this plays out. I mean, on one hand, you have a 90-day reprise now where people can get their cargo out of China. We don't know how much that's going to go back up. Some people have said it will never go back up, towards triple digits again. But there is that uncertainty, and we see carriers aggressively trying to take capacity out and have blank and void sailings. Also, we've seen Southeast Asia emerge more and more, just like we did during COVID, in particular Vietnam. Um, but I guess again, trying to think about replacing or moving your supply chain from China to Vietnam, especially if you're not one of the mega retailers, is a tall order, right?
It is, and I think a lot of customers, you hear, when people try to get away from tariffs, there's things you can do and there's things you can't do. And I think after the initial tariff increase to, north of 100% tariff for China goods, you saw a lot of solutions. And I think one or two of them was bonded warehouses was a solution. Being able to bring cargo into a bonded warehouse, use I think it's called a warehouse entry for customs, allows you some flexibility on bringing that cargo out when the tariffs come down. The other is utilizing, free trade zones to help delay the payment. You're not going to reduce the percentage, but you can at least reduce when you have to pay it. Those are all
Yes.
perfectly legal and responsible. But then there's a lot of customers tried to ship cargo to Vietnam and simply repackage or rebrand it as made in Vietnam or made in other countries. And a lot of those importers are going to get slapped on the wrist. I think there was some stats that were posted and US Customs brought in millions of dollars of fines recently, partially in related to the China tariffs, where they said, hey, this is an improperly um, entry good against the wrong commodity, the wrong HTS code, and they've CBP is watching. They got their eyes out for importers trying to skirt the rules. And so at the end of the day, all you can really do is do the right thing, is move your supply chain to other countries, but that takes a lot of time. That takes years. And sometimes years is, multiple years, let alone one.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. I read a piece last week where again, smaller importers, by the time they got to the right factory in Vietnam, the larger retailers had already taken the capacity for the next 3 to 4 months. So it's incredibly difficult, especially for smaller, as you said, less nimble importers that don't have the balance sheet to try and kind of withstand these uh these wild tariff swings. Um, it'll be very interesting to see how will we see before the 90 days are up, will we see a kind of a more complete agreement to take away that level of uncertainty? Because again, I remember speaking to a retailer in March, and the biggest product they were going to ship that month was artificial Christmas trees. So, like, just it gives you an idea of just how far ahead retailers have to think in terms of like producing products, getting samples, getting the production lines up to run, and then getting the product on shelves. Like you said, for end of year, it's got to be that Black Friday time. But also, it might be worth also touching on, as you mentioned there, Andrew, on the exporter side, it's also been very difficult, I would say.
Absolutely. Because a lot of exporters, their biggest markets are China. And so you could look at, my background, I spent a little bit of time in forest product logistics. And so you have, kiln drying lumber, you have logs, you have, wood, what is considered wood waste or wood from the United States still moves to China. And a lot of that just got completely turned off. You move a container of logs, you might make a 5% margin, the exporter. You add in a 25% tariff, they're not going to ship that cargo at a loss. And a lot of them didn't have the ability to ship that cargo, with these tariffs that, China imposed on the US with the retaliatory, if you will, tariffs. So it's going to be interesting to see how do the US exporters navigate these changes. Are they able to find new markets? Are they able to find markets in China where the price can work? And a lot of it we don't know yet. And it's going to be very interesting to see where these commodities start to move out of the US. Or do we have to keep it here? Do you have to find new markets in Canada or Mexico or domestic markets? How does that all play out for a lot of these commodity shippers?
Yeah, definitely. And again, kind of thinking back to the COVID era, it also starts to kind of uh, cause a lot of issues on equipment, right? So when equipment is not flowing back, I mean, obviously, like you said, there's a lot of empties moving back on the Trans-Pacific trade back to Asia, but still a significant amount of, full agricultural products and food products and recyclable goods and all of that. But when you don't have those exports, you don't have the equipment flowing back, and that also to your earlier point about these guaranteed loadings, you almost need a guarantee to get access to empty equipment because that's something that crept up on a lot of carriers during COVID, right? Like not having the right equipment at the right point or the right port.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that'll be interesting is do we see any congestion coming out of Asia? It's one thing for a lot more cargo to be moving. It's another thing for the rates to be really high. It's another thing for equipment to be low. But one of the real big compounders of every single one of those issues is congestion. When ships can't get into ports on time, they're delayed waiting outside a port, or they have to start changing their rotations because a Shanghai is backed up or a Yantian is backed up. That is a big problem that the carriers and the shippers out of Asia may have to deal with is you might not have the right ships calling in the right orders. And so you run out of equipment before the next ship can bring in empties or bring in that new equipment. We're seeing a lot of congestion in Europe right now. There's, some labor situations. There's a lot of new service rotations in Europe that are causing some headaches. But at the end of the day, if you have that headache in Asia leading into this, what's going to be a very busy 90 days of shipping, it's gonna hurt a lot of exporters out of Asia and a lot of importers here to the US.
Yeah, definitely. Again, just seeing, the benchmarks moving up. Like we mentioned, numbers like 25, 30%, spot rates at six, $7,000. Um, I even saw a mention of $10,000 this morning. I mean, it's pretty difficult for shippers to plan ahead given the tariffs and these kind of exceptionally high rate increases. It'll be very interesting to see, again, from a carrier perspective, how this plays out. I mean, we're hearing rumors of peak season surcharges, emergency surcharges, across different carriers. Um, I mean, it's just a very fluid situation that you just have to keep on top of, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where, humble brag, a little bit of a plug for, Ship Angel. Being able to make the best decision whenever you have to make a decision is going to be extremely important. Do you have all of the options in front of you? Do you know all of the time lead times? You know all of the total prices? It's going to be really important to make decisions, but to make the right decisions and have all of the data so that if you make a decision and it ultimately comes back to haunt you, you can at least say, "Hey, I made a data-driven decision on something. I didn't just, take a whim or guess."
Yeah, definitely. And that does bring us to a very interesting point as well. I mean, we've got we live in a world now where there are basically constant supply chain disruptions on a global basis. It's kind of a new normal. We just go from one to another. We try and mitigate, like you say. But we're also living through or about to live through one of the most exciting technologies, depending on who you talk to, possibly ever. Um, like some people compare AI to the internet and they compare it to cloud computing. Um, Other more optimistic folks, which I may or may not be one of, would compare it to, more like when humans discovered electricity, that it's going to make that type of an impact. It's going to change every industry. pretty radically, and every industry is different. Supply chain has been slower to adopt um, software at scale, certainly kind of modern software at scale. So in one way, it kind of like um, it almost magnifies the opportunity that's there um, to make shippers' lives easier. And like you said, if you're a shipper today and you are trying to make all these bookings on the fly and you're trying to understand what is my actual rate to make a booking, the stakes are pretty high. If I miss that PSS, I could be out by 100%. I could be booking at, I think it's 3,000, but it might be $6,000. Um, that's an incredibly difficult situation again for a shipper to be in.
And in artificial intelligence, Graham, when I have questions about AI, I come to you as I might call the professional here in the company when it comes to AI. But give me a sense and our listeners a little bit of the Ship Angel story. What is our backstory? Why AI? Why not API? Why not BPO centers? Why is AI in shipping rates important?
Yeah, so I think it's really about AI versus BPO centers because traditionally BPO centers have been the go-to for pretty much every rate management platform um, that has existed before Ship Angel. And maybe a decade ago that made sense. But I think with where we are on AI, it doesn't make sense to have traditionally BPO centers tend to be in lower cost labor countries like India or the Philippines. And by AI standards, they are considered expensive, but more importantly, fraught with errors. So from a ship angel perspective, people ask me all the time about building supply chain software and what's the most important thing. One of the most important things I always think about is um, coming from it from I call it a middle case. So in our industry, we have very smart people from the software world and we have very smart people from the supply chain world. And if you kind of go at it from an extreme on either side, if you think you can just build software and it will solve all of the world's supply chain issues, you're mistaken. And if you think that you can just come at it from a supply chain perspective without deep automation and AI, I believe you're also mistaken. So for us, it was about building a great product from the ground up, um, and that had to be AI centric. So instead of a bunch of people taking rate sheets and keying them into a system, um, the ability for to teach a computer how to do it, and actually some people think today that's actually that must be easy now. Like I can just upload a 100-page document to ChatGPT and it can give me a thorough breakdown and it can, but the fact is that LLMs really like large text LLMs have pretty much consumed around a decade or a bit more ago, Google indexed every written book that was pretty much ever written. So when you think about it, these LLMs have ingested every word that's ever been written, online and offline, and it has perfect recall. So when you feed it complex documents, it can understand the concept of those documents. But if you give it a 4,500 line rate sheet that has all sorts of intricacies and terms and conditions and um, specific language. And even today, like one of the big LLMs on one of our PDFs scored around 40% last week, where we're consistently above 90. So um, I think at the start, if you want to build a really great software company, you have to kind of go and kind of make what was really the tougher decision back in 2023 to actually utilize AI. For 6 to 9 months were pretty painful. And when I spoke at TPM, I talked about our technology being the most advanced in the world today for managing rate sheets at scale. And I believe that's still the case. So I think for us, it was about building a first product that delighted our customers makes their lives easier, which we've done. And as we look at expanding our product range uh, pretty significantly towards the end of the year, um, you can reuse that AI in lots of different ways. We now use the same AI to read invoices, as you know, and in time it'll read lots of other shipping documents. Um, so it's actually quite exciting. I think in terms of thinking about the shipper journey too, um, like if you're a shipper, you're using AI in lots of parts of your business, in finance, in writing contracts, in HR, it only makes sense that you should have great supply chain tools as well that are kind of AI driven that are solver your most difficult problems.
Yeah, it's interesting, a bit of perspective. I have a team that kind of I work with underneath me where we do a lot of the reviewing of what our AI is able to process. And what's interesting is, you bring in a brand new shipper, a brand new rate sheet with 10,000 lanes or 10,000 rates, and it looks simple. When you plug it into the AI, the first time it reads it, it gets a percentage of it correct. But what's been fascinating is the second, the third, the fourth time with a little bit of behind the scenes magic that our AI machine learning team can do. It's able to process these rate sheets extremely accurately, better than my my team that can, understand those contracts and rates that they come in. And it's been really impressive to watch the pace at which the AI can learn rate sheets and customers very specific information. We have customers in our business that come in with rates that are very complex, but they're also very fragmented. There's three or four different spreadsheets that all look different. They interact differently, but we're able to very much stitch these together through the help of our AI system internally. And it's incredibly impressive to watch the pace at which it can help us process and help us process rates for customers. I have to imagine what is other software outside of just rates, but software for other parts of the supply chain and relates to AI. What is that going to look like in 6, 8 months? Not years, but 6 to 8 months. Where do you foresee AI being 6 to 8 months
Yeah,
in its ability to do other supply chain stuff, not just manage rates? Or you mentioned invoices, not just be able to read and parse out invoices. What's that frontier look like, Grant?
we're going to be very close to artificial general intelligence, which is effectively the machines being as intelligent as a human with like 110 IQ that can do the tasks of, a PhD researcher. And two examples where I think that will kind of make a big difference is, again, I think if you're an ambitious software company, this is the time to, build great solutions, take advantage of the whole AI ecosystem and move fast. Um, and two examples of that would be first, again, when we think about, I mean, we picked rates for a number of reasons. The biggest one was it was the biggest pain point, multiplied by the least kind of attacked vector within the space. So it really needed to be solved. But the second reason is that rates probably is the most difficult part. As you said, Andrew, the AI is learning all the time. It reinforces learning. Once it sees something and you tell it, well, this is where you went wrong, this is why, it knows when it sees it again. So it gets more intelligent very, very quickly, very, very fast, and you can throw a lot of data at it. And if you're a machine that's reading complex rate sheets and you have to turn to reading invoices, it's an order of magnitude easier to read invoices. They're much more simpler. The data is quite similar, and we think about that in terms of in software terms as shared components. Like what do you have already in your software stack that you can reuse as you build out future products. Um, and you could see that kind of going into like, POs, like how could you read POs? How could you put them together faster and easier with less of a human input so the humans can do kind of higher level tasks, more creative tasks than trying to stitch POs together. So I think that's exciting, but probably the bigger part is you made a point earlier, Andrew, about you're sitting there and you're like, I have to make a booking. Which one? Like, is this my rate? Is this the right carrier? Is this vessel voided? Is this the right one? Is there a faster one? How do I do it? You've got to do that multiple times per day with not all of the data, not all the latest data in front of you.
What's difficult to that is you don't know what you don't know sometimes, and that's where you need that help.
And really what you want is, a kind of a superhuman assistant that just is there all the time with you to help you make these decisions faster, um, present data to you faster, present probabilities to you, make suggestions when something goes wrong, helping you immediately, saving you significant time.
One of the things I think is super interesting, I'm by nature am not a computer science person. I can do well on a laptop. I can do well in Excel, but you get beyond that, and I'm out of my league. When it comes to artificial intelligence, AI in the supply chain space, why are APIs important? And so I come from a world where the word EDI was written in stone, and now the last 2 years, we've seen the introduction of APIs. It's kind of like the next great thing, but I don't think it's understood very well. So how does AI play into the idea of APIs, which I think is all related to transmitting data, correct, Graham?
Yeah, exactly. Like the EDI protocol came about with the EU, I think it was in the 60s or 70s. And it's effectively a computer transmitting a large Excel file to another computer. And it can be in different formats, CSV or lots of different EDI formats. But, and you're right, I mean, it still is the de facto way to make ocean bookings today. More ocean bookings are made via EDI versus API. Um, but the problem is that they tend to it's a very slow protocol. Traditionally, it would be a file that would be passed on a daily basis. So that's where it's very, very difficult on the booking side because if you make a booking at 9:30 a.m. on a Monday, you mightn't hear back until midday on Tuesday. And of course, there are ways to do EDIs much more regularly than daily, but that's the standard. Um, APIs are a much better protocol. To your earlier point, you don't know what you don't know. In an API driven world, you do know because you have literally the latest data. So instead of getting an EDI flat file that says X, you get an API that's telling you in real time it's not, it's actually Y. Um, so APIs are really, really important. And they're really one of the drivers as well. So yeah, I think the emergence or the kind of acceleration of APIs with where just we are on the AI software cycle, just how fast we're moving. I do think that you're going to start to see more and more um solutions that will help you to make the best decision much faster, much easier. Um, and I think that's kind of, one of the big use cases we see going into next year.
Yeah, I think that the big thing is when rates are $2,000 a 40 foot, it's important to make the most cost-effective, valuable decision for a company. When rates are $7,000 a 40-foot container, a bad decision costs you six, 700% more than it should when rates are lower. And so you have a lot less margin of error where rates are headed. And it'll be very interesting to see how can you leverage AI, APIs, and essentially data to ensure you're making that best decision, to ensure you're having data-driven reasons for making those decisions. Otherwise, at some point when something goes wrong, someone's going to ask why. And having that data to support your decision, you can ultimately say, I made the best decision that I could make at that time. And with the data, with the AI helping you, it gives you the ability to make that decision and not feel like you're making an incorrect decision.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Andrew. I mean, again, it just, the theme for me is pressure on shippers. And the pressure on shippers is if I'm going to make 10 decisions a day on who to book with, or when the rates are five, six, $7,000, it's much more difficult, and the pressure is much more significant than when they're $2,000. Um, and I think that is kind of where solutions like Ship Angel and others need to kind of keep pushing towards. I mean, our job at the end of the day is to make our customers' lives a little bit easier. And, when you're in the midst of um, the uncertainty that these shippers are now in, you've got tariffs, you've got a stopwatch with the tariffs, and then on the opposite side, you've got, rates that are skyrocketing up. So yeah, it's super, super high pressure.
Hey, it's a very important game. It's not like we're playing chess or checkers. We're playing a game of business, and you got to make the right decisions here.
Yeah, absolutely. Very true. Very true. Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. Another great session. Look forward to episode 3 in the not too distant future. Let's see where in the world we've ended up on this, and I'm sure there'll be more interesting topics to discuss.
Looking forward to it, Graham. Thank you. See you soon.